There are an estimated 60 million people worldwide who have been forcibly displaced from their homes. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, there were 13 million refugees in mid-2014, and that number is growing. But it's overshadowed by the even greater numbers of internally displaced people, or IDPs, who have not crossed an international border in search of shelter and safety. At the end of 2014, the number of IDPs was a record 38 million people forcibly displaced within their own country by violence. 11 million of them were uprooted in 2014. That's the equivalent of 30,000 people a day. The numbers are massive, but each is an individual struggling to find a life of safety and fulfillment. What are their experiences? How are they coping? And what can we do to help address their plight? Welcome to McGill Talks. I'm Jacquie Rourke. We've assembled a panel of experts to discuss the plight of refugees. Megan Bradley is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill and a member of the Institute for the Study of International Development. Professor Bradley's research focuses on refugees and forced migration, human rights, transitional justice, and humanitarianism. She's author of the recently released book, Forced Migration, Reconciliation, and Justice. Kirsten Johnson is an assistant professor of family medicine, an affiliate faculty member at the Institute for Health and Social Policy at McGill, and an affiliate at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative at Harvard. Dr. Johnson is also program director of the McGill Humanitarian Studies Initiative, and she is CEO of Humanitarian U and an emergency physician at the MUHC. And Cécile Rousseau is a research and clinical psychiatrist at the Montreal Children's Hospital, where she directs the Transcultural Child Psychiatry Clinic. Her clinical work is with refugee children and with torture victims. She also does consultation work for health institutions and school boards on refugee children. Dr. Rousseau's current research involves refugee children and adolescents from Southeast Asia, Central America, and Somalia. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you.
We're going to delve into your experiences working with refugees and find out a lot more about what they deal with. Megan, I want to start with you. You started your career as a resettlement caseworker with the UNHCR in Egypt. Can you tell us a little bit about the people you met there? Try to take us into the camps and some of the stories that you remember.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was right at the beginning of my career, and at the time I was working predominantly with Somali refugee women who had come to Egypt fleeing the civil war in Somalia. So actually, the majority of refugees around the world don't live in camps, and in Egypt at the time, none of the refugees that we were working with were encamped. They were living in the city, usually in slums, in apartments with sometimes 12, 13, 14 people crowded into just a room or two. At the time, Cairo was a city where a refugee might have a fairly good chance of being resettled to a Western country like Canada, where they could build a new life for themselves. And some people call resettlement, the golden ticket for refugees, and that it opens up opportunities that for the vast majority are inaccessible. So 86% of the world's refugees remain in developing countries where they have very limited access to resources. I had the privilege of working with Somali refugee women who were being resettled to the United States. A lot of them are really flourishing now in their home community, but what they went through before getting on that plane was, really incredible in many cases. So some of the women that we were working with, for example, had sold absolutely everything that their families owned in order to buy plane tickets to get themselves to Egypt, and lost children in a firefight at the airport and had to make the decision of whether they get on the plane or whether they stay and bury their child. So, even in that final act of escape, people face hurdles that, from the perspective of a safe and prosperous life in Montreal, can be hard to contemplate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kirsten, as a medical doctor, you've seen the impact from a health perspective. Mm-hmm. Can you describe some of the major concerns that you see among refugees, either in camps or elsewhere? Access to healthcare, access to vaccinations. What have you seen?
Certainly. I mean, it's not just what I've seen, but what we know is that once people are forced to displace, they're much more vulnerable to disease, morbidity, and mortality. In fact, studies have shown they're up to 12 to 20 times more vulnerable of morbidity, illness, and death just by virtue of being displaced. Now, we should consider that over 50% of people who are displaced are women and children, and they're by far the most vulnerable. In a study that was done done by Rick Brennan and the International Rescue Committee in the Congo. In fact, it showed that for every one violent death that a refugee or internally displaced person might face, there are 62 nonviolent deaths, and the majority of those are from health-related causes, and over half of those are children under 5. So they're very vulnerable, and certainly, it is often not considered that women and children are forced into flight. Certainly, what we saw in Sudan and Chad were that many of the men were killed, and so the women and children were forced to make it over the border into camps with almost nothing in a land that was over 50 degrees heat, sandstorms, dust storms, no food, really a desert wasteland, and to be forced to flee with your children and make it across and then face gender-based violence and other issues concerning health and access to proper nutrition and basic needs. It's quite amazing that people even survive.
Can you think of a particular story that kind of, when you're speaking with friends and whatnot and they ask you about your work, that you think really brings home the difficulty that refugees have in accessing any kind of decent health care?
Mm-hmm, I can, because in fact I do research as well. I don't just work as a clinical physician. I'm a clinician scholar, and I have done a lot of work looking at gender-based violence, specifically looking at rape as a weapon of war and the systematic nature of that crime. And I was involved with Physicians for Human Rights in a study that ended up going to the criminal court to help to indict Omar Bashir for crimes against humanity. And essentially what we did was we went into the refugee camps just on the border of the Chad-Sudan border, and we interviewed women from the 3 different ethnic groups. And I met this one woman who had escaped the violence in Sudan and made it across with her 3 children. But in the process of that, her husband was killed, and she witnessed that. And she managed to escape there. What would happen is that the Janjaweed would loot and burn the villages, and so she managed to escape with a piece of his clothing that was bloodstained, and she showed that to me. And she was there with her children, with other women who had experienced the same plight, and then were forced somehow to reconcile this and survive in very meager conditions in this camp in Chad. So those stories of women and their resiliency and finding solutions to these situations, which were so arduous, were quite memorable for me.
Thank you. Kirsten talks about the healthcare needs of refugees. You deal with refugees when they come to Montreal, their psychiatric needs. I'm sure when you've gone through experiences like this, you've got some serious needs. Tell us a bit about what you're seeing.
Most refugee and our research in Montreal corroborates that over decades, most refugees have suffered pre-migratory trauma, very often not just one, but cumulative trauma and severe forms, even kids over time. And the kind of growing public opinion impression that these people are fraud, liars, that they use the argument of trauma to get in. Now, our clinical experience is that it's rather the reverse. A lot of refugee trauma is under the water, so people do not talk about it because of shame, because of fear, and because in a lot of culture, being a victim is not a good thing. You don't want to appear as a victim. I remember, for example, the history of Shiva. So Shiva is a 4-year-old from South Asia. And he came to our attention because the daycare called us saying, this kid is terrified. This is a savage kid. He hides under table. He bites, he hits, and we're absolutely unable to establish a contact with him. And they thought that there was probably physical abuse and maltreatment from mom. And in fact, the story, which took a long time to obtain, was that Shiva was in a very loving family in South Asia until his dad was abducted for political reason, and he had to go to the hospital to see dad with mom. When mom was called, to face the torture corpse of his dad. After that, probably he presents his mother being raped, and he was himself hit and burned. And it took us a very long time to establish a relation with Shiva, to establish a relation with Mom. And I think it's when Mom told us, is there a future for widow? Because you know that in South Asia and in some culture, even if you're a young woman, if you're a widow, your life kind of stops. And what she was asking is, in fact, can I have a future here with you? Can I have a future in Canada? So the whole idea or premises that refugees talk and use their trauma for political reason, I think is a false premises. A lot of people do not talk about it, and we miss a lot of these stories.
And of course, you're head of the Transcultural Psychiatric Unit, so culture comes into play here. All the differences that people are used to. What about prejudice for refugees? I'm sure they face an enormous amount of prejudice.
Well, I think this is a very important point. In the 80s, the first waves of refugees to Canada were very welcome. They were the Chilean, the South American, and Canada was a wonderful asylum for refugees. Now, things have changed with time, and the situation in terms of our policy for refugees is not that good. So, for example, we have kids who were traumatized in their country of origin and have been re-traumatized because they've seen their parents shackled in front of them, or kind of harshly abducted to be detained because they didn't have the appropriate identity paper. And these kids kind of lose trust because they were told by their parents, you know, in Canada we'll be safe. In Canada there are good people, we'll be safe. And seeing their parents shackled or humiliated in front of them is a terrible blow. Reconstructing this trust in us takes time. So yes, we have to be very careful on how do we welcome these people. Do they feel welcome?
Thank you very much. Megan, you work with IDPs, internally displaced people. That's not a term that many of us are too familiar with. Tell us what we need to know about IDPs and what tends to happen. They're displaced within their own homeland, so they don't quite come up on the same refugee numbers that the UNHCR puts out.
So internally displaced persons, or IDPs, are those, as you say, who are trapped within their own countries. These include people who are displaced by violence, by war, but also people who are displaced by natural disasters. So there are in fact more people who are uprooted every year by natural disasters than by war, although we don't tend to hear as much about those who've had to flee their homes because of a natural disaster. In terms of my work, it's clear that there are a whole range of reasons why someone might end up an IDP rather than a refugee. So for some, they just don't have the resources to get out of their own country. They don't have the money to make that trip, particularly if they live a long way from a border. In other cases, sick family members might be unable to travel, and so they have very little option but to perhaps take shelter in another part of their own city, but they can't make a long trip to seek refuge abroad. In some cases, people are trying to protect their businesses, what few assets they have, and so they'll try to stay relatively close to home in order to make that trip back, to make sure that the possessions that they have in the world that are so important to their livelihoods aren't lost.
Do they get access to the same kind of care that a refugee does? How does that play out?
It varies significantly. So in theory, a government is responsible for its own citizens who are displaced within their own countries. But what we see in practice is that it's often the governments who are causing the displacement. So what's going on in Syria right now is significantly the responsibility of the Syrian government, as well as other forces like ISIS. So it's very difficult in these kinds of contexts for IDPs to receive the kind of assistance that they need. There are often huge barriers to humanitarian organizations like the UN Refugee Agency being able to work in conflict contexts and reach IDPs. But there are also problems in terms of the support that donor countries like Canada provide for IDPs. We tend to provide much more support on a financial basis for each refugee than we do for IDPs. So there's a real structural inequality in the system.
And what
typically
who can
happens
get
to them?
support.
Do they get resettled? Do they?
IDPs rarely have the opportunity to be resettled. That's something that is provided more commonly as an opportunity for refugees, although it's still a tiny proportion of refugees worldwide, less than 1 or 2% each year, who have the opportunity to be resettled.
So what should countries do to, because it's a huge number, as we've seen, much more than the refugees, what should countries be doing to address sort of the concerns of IDPs, especially in places where their own home governments are the cause of it?
Well, that's a big question, really. In part, it's making sure that the humanitarian aid agencies that are providing essential support to these populations have the resources that they need, financially and otherwise, to do their jobs. It's about applying the political pressure that's needed to resolve the conflicts that cause internal displacement crises, to try to address the kinds of structural problems that lead to large-scale displacement in natural disaster situations as well.
Okay. Now, Kirsten, your interest is in professionalizing humanitarian work. Why is that important now? Describe for us a little bit about who shows up when disaster strikes and how sometimes it's not as coordinated as it possibly could be.
Certainly. I mean, one thing that we know is that the humanitarian sector is one of the fastest growing in the world, and it employs thousands, if not millions of people worldwide, both in terms of disaster and humanitarian response. And so it's coordinated by the United Nations, but certainly the operational agencies or organizations on the ground are, they number in the thousands, but generally there's about 30 to 40 lead organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, International Medical Committee, IRC, et cetera, that are first on the ground. Now, something that we saw in Haiti, and I'll give you the example of this to contextualize the importance of professionalizing the sector, is that there are over 3,000 non-governmental organizations that went to respond to the earthquake in 2010. Certainly that involved a lot of people who were internally displaced within their country because of this natural disaster. But, we saw this huge number of orthopedic injuries, traumas, that kind of thing. And so a large number of medical personnel were being seconded from academic institutions all over North America. Many of these didn't have training. In fact, many of them were in their residency or not even trained as staff physicians, for example. And we saw people doing field amputations on Haitians without proper field hospital settings, without anesthetic. In fact, it became a real crisis in the initial few days because plane loads of these physicians were being flown in and blocking the runway, which needed to be open for essential supplies and for organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières who know what they're doing. And so this led to a big outcry and several, investigations by international groups, the UN, World Health Organization, and from this, certainly within the health, humanitarian health sector, it's widely recognized that we need to implement some sort of standard. We need to professionalize. This is over, this industry has been growing and certainly within the last 25 years has developed standards of practice. There's accountability in the sector, there's a science behind what we do, and it's a specialized body of knowledge, and more people are calling this a career choice. So there is no real, 10 years ago there was a lot of debate about this, but I think everybody's kind of come to the realization that there needs to be more accountability, and professionalizing the sector is one way to do that. So, I'm one of the big drivers behind that, and one of the ways we do that is through proper training and education, competency-based, performance measured, and standardized in the sector.
What are some of the biggest surprises that healthcare personnel face when they land in a place like Haiti?
Certainly. I think if you're not trained, you have to understand that just because you're a professional physician, it doesn't mean that those same competencies translate into a field environment. It's hugely chaotic, and you need to know about the technical sectors in order to coordinate and operate. For example, if you're going to set up a field hospital in a place like Haiti, you need to know how many liters of water you need per person per day. You need to know how much space you need between tents or beds. You need to know where you're going to set up your shelter. You need to know about site planning. You need to know about who to coordinate with. And you need to know the public health priorities like vaccination, which is so important when we're talking about measles epidemics and so on. So there's a really defined body of knowledge that needs to go on. And I think when people who are not trained in that land, I think they find themselves in a very chaotic environment. And I think many find themselves kind of feeling like they can't contribute in the way they want to in a meaningful way.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm sure that there's never enough psychiatric resources anywhere. It seems to be very much the forgotten, and yet when you hear about the experiences of people, you may have a broken leg, but how's your mind and how's your heart? Tell us about the resources for that.
Build on what Christine was saying. Very often, when refugees come to us, people refer kids or family because the story are horrific, and they, as physicians, teachers, whatever, are horrified. Now, this may be the priority or not. Sometimes the priority may be iron deficiency, because that's why the kid is sleeping in school. Sometimes there's nothing in the fridge. And you don't work on trauma if there's nothing in the fridge. You work on the fridge to be sure that there's something to eat. And we forget this very simple thing, that they may not, even here in Canada and Quebec, there may not be something in the fridge. Now, after that, I think we should think mental health services as the tip of the iceberg. So one of the things that we've worked a lot on is how to address the mental needs of refugees and migrants, because you have a lot of migrants who also came from this country and have experienced traumatic experience within their more natural environment, which is school. And I think school have a key role in prevention. So I won't go into details, but we use a lot of art and creative expression so that kids are able to make sense of their experience, build bridge between their past and their future, imagine a future, build bridge between home and the school and this diverse environment, and reconcile themselves with human beings and humanity. So I think that if we want to reach refugee kids, and this is also true in the refugee camps, schools are kind of the first step, the cornerstone. And then we have kids who come to our services, and then we have to question our approaches, post-traumatic stress disorder. When is this relevant and for who? How should we address it? We Western people have a tendency to push disclosure. We want people to speak about trauma. Sometimes good, sometimes not. So I remember Ahmed, a 9-year-old boy from Algeria, having witnessed terrible trauma. And after an interview with his family, he stayed with us, and we were not sure that therapy was the appropriate mean for him. And then I asked him if he wanted to draw, and he nodded. This was too anxiety-provoking. So I said, "Can I draw for you?" And then he said, "Yes." And something from Algeria or Canada? And he says, "Something from Canada." And I said, "So what?" He said, "An elephant." So I drew the first Canadian elephant. And he told me the elephant was sad but couldn't cry. And he told me the elephant would have liked to talk. And then we decided that we would, offer therapy, but that's not always the case. That's not always a priority. So the idea is we have skills, we have specialized knowledge. They're precious, they're good resources. But as Christine was saying, when do we need that? And when do we need to think with the family and the community outside our box, so something else?
Well, as professionals who've all worked with refugees, I'd like each of you to take a stab at this last question. What do you wish the public knew? What do you wish governments knew about what you know, having worked with these individuals?
There are many people who are never going to be resettled to a Western country like Canada. As I mentioned, it's maybe 1 or 2% each year who have that opportunity. So we can't lose sight of the vast majority of people who are living in highly under-resourced situations. So for example, in Lebanon right now, it's estimated that 1 in every 3 people are Syrian, and the vast majority of those are refugees. So we might spend a lot of time talking about what Canada should do, what Europe should do in terms of taking people in as refugees here, but we can't lose sight of the massive needs that exist in the frontline host countries. But then again, resettlement is an opportunity that is not just benefiting refugees, it's also benefiting us as Canadians. And so I don't think we should necessarily be thinking about this as some sort of charitable act. It's something that is in our tradition. I think it's in our best interests as well, and we can do much more on both fronts.
Kirsten.
A lot of these people don't actually even want to resettle. They don't want to leave their homes. They're proud of where they come from, and they want to be able to go home and start their lives again. So I think, helping them to have regain livelihoods, build patterns of resilience, contribute to them becoming what the best they can be in their situation, and then hopefully being able to go home. Is very important, and we can't forget that. I think that this, poor refugee concept and I'm going to go help them because I'm Canadian and I can kind of thing it's very misconstrued, and I think that we need to think about them in a way that empowers them.
Thank you. Cécile.
Well, I certainly would like decision makers and our public to think back of our own history. We often say Canada is a land of immigrant. Canada is certainly a land of refugee. A lot of our parents and grandparents went through the Second World War, First World War, and came because of that here. I think it's important to think of us like that, so the refugee are like we were.
Thank you very much. Cécile Rousseau, Megan Bradley, Kirsten Johnson, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and helping us understand a little bit better the plight of refugees. And thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us next time when McGill Talks.